The moment Rhodes limped through the dust-choked main street of Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, every soul within eyeshot knew that whatever had driven that woman across 300 miles of open prairie had not broken her, not even close. She had walked the last 11 miles. That was the fact of it, plain and unadorned, the way most hard truths presented themselves in the territory. The stagecoach wheel had cracked clean through on a rutted stretch of road somewhere between Medicine Lodge and the outskirts of Caldwell, and the driver, a heavy-set man named Earl who smelled of chewing tobacco and defeat, had announced that he could not promise how long repairs might take. Could be 2 hours, could be until morning. Rose had stood there in the blazing afternoon sun, looked at her luggage, one sturdy leather trunk and a canvas bag that held everything she owned of consequence, and made a decision that Earl would later describe to anyone who would listen as the most pig-headed thing he had ever witnessed in 30 years of hauling passengers across the Kansas plains. She had hoisted the canvas bag over her shoulder, left the trunk with Earl after making him swear on his mother's grave to deliver it to the Sutton ranch, and started walking. The country was not kind about it. The road was little more than a suggestion pressed into the red-brown earth by wagon wheels and cattle hooves, and the sun sat fat and merciless in a sky that offered not a single cloud for comfort. By the 3rd mile her boots, good boots, sturdy ones she had saved for 8 months to purchase in Cincinnati before boarding the train west, had begun to punish her in ways she had not anticipated. By the 6th mile she had stopped noticing the pain in the way that a body sometimes mercifully goes quiet about its complaints, when it understands that stopping is not an option. By the time she reached the main street of Caldwell, the blisters had burst and healed and burst again, and she walked with the careful, deliberate stride of a woman who was absolutely not going to allow anyone to see that she was hurting. Her dark hair had long since escaped its pins and hung in damp waves around her face. Her green dress, the nicest one she owned, was coated from the hem to the knee in fine red dust. Her eyes, however, those fierce, dark eyes that her mother had always said looked like they belonged to someone who had already survived everything the world might throw at her, were bright and clear and burning with something that the good citizens of Caldwell would later argue about in the saloon for weeks afterward. Some called it determination. The blacksmith's wife said it was fury. Old Pete Hargrove, who had seen the buffalo herds and the Comanche wars and 3 floods and 1 tornado in his 72 years, said it was the most specific kind of courage. The kind that came from someone who had already decided they were going to be all right before they had any evidence to support that conclusion. Rhodes did not look at the faces peering at her from doorways and boardwalks. She had a destination, and she was going to it. Emmett Sutton was standing outside the land office when he saw her. He had come into town for the ordinary reasons: feed supplies, a conversation with the banker about the water rights on his north pasture, and the somewhat less ordinary reason that today, according to the letter he had received 6 weeks ago, was the day his mail-order bride was supposed to arrive on the 2 o'clock stage. It was now close to 5 in the afternoon, and Emmett had spent the better part of 3 hours talking himself in and out of a half-dozen different feelings about the whole arrangement. He was 31 years old, a practical man by nature and by necessity, and he had approached the matter of finding a wife the same way he approached most things: methodically, without excessive sentiment, and with a clear eye toward what was needed. What was needed, practically speaking, was a woman who could manage a household, who was not afraid of hard work, and who could tolerate the particular brand of loneliness that came with living 12 miles from town on a cattle operation that demanded everything a person had to give. He had corresponded with Rhodes for 4 months. Her letters had been direct, thoughtful, occasionally surprising, and entirely without the kind of performed helplessness that some women seemed to think would recommend them. She had told him plainly that she was 24 years old, that she had grown up on a small farm in Ohio before moving to Cincinnati to work as a seamstress, that she had never been married, that she did not expect romance from this arrangement, but she did expect honesty, and that she could cook, preserve, sew, garden, and had once assisted in the birth of 3 calves in a single night when her uncle's farmhand had taken ill. So she was not, as she put it, easily unsettled by the realities of agricultural life. Emmett had read that letter 3 times. He had written back. The correspondence had continued, and somewhere in the practical exchange of practical information, something less practical had begun to develop, a quality to her sentences that made him sit with the letters longer than was strictly necessary. A particular turn of phrase she had about the way the Ohio River looked in November that had stayed with him through 2 cattle drives and a hard winter. He had told himself it was nothing. He had told himself that regularly. And then he saw her walking down the main street of Caldwell, covered in dust, limping in a way she was clearly working very hard not to limp, with her chin up and her eyes forward, and an expression on her face that suggested she had personally taken offense at every obstacle the Kansas plains had put in her path and intended to address each one in turn. His first thought was that he had made a terrible mistake, not about the arrangement, but about himself, because the feeling that went through him in that moment was not the feeling of a practical man making a practical assessment. It moved through his chest like the first crack of spring thunder, sudden and total, and it left him standing on the boardwalk with his hat halfway off his head and absolutely no memory of having reached up to remove it. His ranch hand, a wiry 22-year-old named Billy Crane who had been with Emmett for 3 years and considered himself something of an authority on the subtleties of human nature, was standing beside him. Billy looked at the woman. He looked at Emmett. He looked at the woman again. "Is that her?" Billy asked. "I believe it is," Emmett said. "She walked here. Appears so." "Emmett," Billy said in the tone of someone delivering an important verdict, "that woman walked 11 miles in dress boots in the middle of May in Kansas." "I can see that, Billy. That is the most prepared bride I have ever seen," Billy said. Emmett looked at Billy. "You have never seen a bride before," Emmett said. "Doesn't mean I'm wrong," Billy said. Emmett put his hat back on his head and stepped off the boardwalk into the street. Rose had spotted him at the same moment. Or rather, she had spotted a man stepping toward her with the particular purposeful stride of someone who knew where he was going. And since there was really only one person in this town who had reason to walk toward her with that kind of intention, she assumed this was Emmett Sutton. He was taller than she had imagined. The letters had not discussed height, because that had not seemed relevant, but now that she was looking at the reality of him standing in the afternoon light, she noted the relevance. He was broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who worked hard physical labor, and had done so for long enough that it had become simply who he was. His hair was dark brown under the hat he wore, and his face, well, his face was the kind of face that would have been called handsome in any drawing room in Ohio, and was in this context something considerably more than that, because it was a face with character in it, with weather in it, with the kind of lines around the eyes that came from squinting into the sun and from something else too, something that she would not be able to name precisely until much later. She stopped walking when they were about 10 feet apart. He stopped too. They looked at each other for a moment that was both very brief and oddly significant. "Miss Rhodes," he said. His voice was low and even, with a quality to it like the flat Kansas horizon, steady without drama, extending further than you first estimated. "Mr. Sutton," she said. "The stage," he began. "Broke a wheel," she finished. "I walked." A pause. 11 miles, he said, "more or less." He glanced down at her feet, which were invisible inside her boots, and then back up at her face. Something moved in his expression, not pity, she was grateful to note. Something closer to recognition. "Are you all right?" he asked. She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, because she had been raised to be honest, and she was not going to start her acquaintance with this man by performing an ease she did not entirely feel. "I will be," she said, "once I've sat down." He nodded once, the way a man nods when someone has said something he finds genuinely reasonable. "Then let's get you somewhere to sit down," he said, and he held out his hand for her bag. she let him take it. That, Rose would think later, was the moment it began, not the letters, not the photograph she had studied for 2 evenings before deciding, not even the walk through the red Kansas dust. It was the moment she handed him her bag, and he took it as if this were the most natural thing in the world, with no ceremony and no condescension, as if he understood already that this was not her being weak but her being sensible, and that those were very different things. He walked her to the hotel. She would spend the night in town, as had been agreed. Propriety required it, and Emmett Sutton was, beneath everything else, a man of propriety, and he arranged for a room and asked the proprietress, Mrs. Garfield, a round-faced widow of cheerful efficiency, whether there might be a basin of hot water and a proper meal sent up. Mrs. Garfield, who had been watching the street drama unfold from her front window for the past 10 minutes, assured him that there most certainly could, and then gave Rose the kind of look that women give each other when they recognize something of themselves. Before he left her at the door of the hotel, Emmett said, "I'll come by tomorrow morning. 9 o'clock. If you need more time, just send word." 9 o'clock is fine, Rose said. He nodded again. He turned to go. Then he stopped. "Miss Rhodes," he said without turning back around. "Mr. Sutton. The letters, I want you to know, I read them carefully. A silence that held a great deal in it." "So did I," she said. He left. She went inside. She sat on the edge of the hotel bed and took her boots off very slowly, and the sharp hiss of breath she drew through her teeth was something she would absolutely have suppressed if anyone had been there to witness it. The blisters were bad. Not catastrophically bad. She had her first aid kit in the canvas bag, because of course she did, because Rose Rhodes did not go anywhere without being prepared for the most likely disasters, and she cleaned and dressed them with the concentrated focus of someone who considers suffering to be primarily a logistical problem. Mrs. Garfield's daughter brought up hot water and a plate of beef stew and biscuits, and Rose ate every bite, because she was hungrier than she had allowed herself to realize. And then she lay back on the bed with her feet elevated on a folded blanket and looked at the pressed tin ceiling of the room and thought about the look on Emmett Sutton's face when he had seen her walking into town. She had expected wariness. She had expected the careful evaluation of a man who had agreed to marry a stranger and was now seeing the reality of his decision. She had expected, at minimum, the polite concealment of disappointment. She knew what she looked like after 11 miles of Kansas road, and she was not under any illusion that dust-caked and limping was her most compelling presentation. She had not expected that expression she had caught for just a moment before he arranged his face back into its natural steadiness. She could not name it. It had gone too quickly, but it had been something. She fell asleep thinking about it. In the morning, her feet were stiff but serviceable, and she dressed carefully, repinned her hair, and was waiting in the hotel lobby at 5 minutes before 9 because she was not the kind of woman who made people wait. Emmett arrived at 9 o'clock exactly, and Rose noted this with approval. He had a wagon. The trunk had arrived. Earl had apparently redeemed himself overnight, and it was loaded in the back. There was also a woman on the wagon seat, a stout, warm-faced woman of about 50 with silver threading through her black hair, and the capable hands of someone who had spent a lifetime doing useful things with them. "This is Dolores Vega," Emmett said as he helped Rose up onto the wagon. "She helps run the house. She wanted to come and meet you." Dolores Vega looked at Rose with dark eyes that missed nothing and seemed to approve of most of what they saw. "He has been nervous for a week," she said by way of greeting. "Dolores," Emmett said. "It is true," Dolores said serenely. "Also, I made tamales for breakfast. You will eat some before we leave town." Rose looked at Emmett, who had the expression of a man long accustomed to losing certain arguments gracefully. "She won't take no for an answer," he said. "I would not dream of saying no to tamales," Rose said. Dolores Vega decided in that moment that she liked Rose Rhodes very much. They ate at the small table behind Dolores' cousin's house on the edge of town, tamales and strong coffee, and a conversation that moved easily among the three of them, touching on practical matters, the house, the ranch, the spring planting, and occasionally less practical ones. Dolers had come to the Sutton Ranch 9 years ago when her husband, a vaquero named Carlos, had worked Emmett's cattle operation. Carlos had died of a fever 4 years back, and Emmett had asked Dolers to stay on, managing the house in exchange for wages and a place that was hers as long as she wanted it. She spoke of this plainly, without sentimentality, and Rose heard in it something that told her a great deal about the man sitting across the table from her. The ride out to the ranch took the better part of 2 hours, and the country opened up around them in the way that Kansas always seemed to gradually at first, and then all at once, so that you went from feeling pressed in by the small structures of town to suddenly confronted with a horizon so wide and uninterrupted that it either frightened you or freed you, depending on the particular composition of your character. Rose sat on the wagon seat beside Emmett. Dolers had positioned herself in the back among the luggage with the comfortable authority of a woman who had made a decision and watched the land unfold. "It's very large," she said. "The ranch," he said. "Kansas," she said. He glanced at her sideways. "It is," he agreed. "Takes some adjusting too. Does it bother you?" She considered this honestly. "No," she said. It's honest, isn't it? There's nothing pretending to be smaller than it is." He was quiet for a moment. "I've never heard it put that way," he said, "but yes, that's exactly what it is." The Sutton Ranch announced itself from a distance, a stand of cottonwood trees around the creek that ran through the property, then the roof of the barn appearing above a gentle swell of earth, then the house itself, a solid 2-story structure of wood and stone that had clearly been built in stages, added to as the operation grew, and the man who ran it had the means to build further. It was not grand, but it was serious, and Rose found that she respected it in the same way she respected things that were built to last rather than to impress. Emmett helped her down from the wagon with a hand that was brief and careful, and she saw the ranch properly for the first time. The barn, the outbuildings, the garden behind the house that was Dolers' domain, the long grass of the home pasture where several horses moved in the late morning light, and 2 ranch hands who were mending fence at the far end of the yard, and had stopped to watch the wagon arrive with the particular careful nonchalance of people who had been specifically told not to stare. Billy Crane, who was not at the fence but rather was leaning against the porch rail with his hat pushed back on his head, raised one hand in greeting. "Miss Rhodes," he called. "I see you survived the walk." "News travels," Rose said. "Earl the stage driver is not a quiet man," Billy said. Rose looked at him, this young man with the open face and the lively eyes, and felt immediately that he was the kind of person who made a place feel inhabited rather than simply occupied. "You must be Mr. Crane," she said. "Billy," he said. "Just Billy. Mr. Crane is my father and he and I have some philosophical disagreements." He pushed off the rail and came down the steps to take her trunk when Emmett lifted it from the wagon. "Welcome to the Sutton place, Miss Rhodes, or I suppose it'll be the Sutton place in a different sense, soon enough." "Soon enough," she agreed. Emmett showed her the house, the kitchen, the sitting room, the 2 upstairs bedrooms, the small room off the kitchen that Dolers used when she chose to sleep in the house, rather than the small cottage at the edge of the property. The tour was conducted with the practical thoroughness of a man who understood that information was courtesy, and Rose asked practical questions and received practical answers. And by the time they had come back around to the kitchen, something between them had shifted almost imperceptibly. The careful formality of strangers had softened towards something that was not yet familiarity, but was its honest precursor. The wedding was arranged for the following Saturday, 6 days away. The preacher, a mild-mannered man named Reverend Aldous Cole who served the small community that clustered around the Caldwell outskirts, would come out to the ranch. Dolers would cook. Billy and the 2 other ranch hands, a quiet, steady man named Samuel Greer and his younger brother Thomas, who was 17 and deeply impressed by almost everything, would serve as witnesses. In those 6 days, Rose learned the rhythms of the ranch the way she had learned everything important in her life, by paying attention and participating and refusing to be decorative when she could be useful instead. She was up before dawn the second morning, in the kitchen with dolers, learning where things were kept and what dolers called the way of the house, which was a specific geography of habit and preference and efficiency that dolers had developed over years and communicated with the gracious authority of someone sharing something genuinely valuable. Rose received it in that spirit. She was a fast learner, attentive and unafraid of correction, and dolers, who had approached this situation with the loyalty of someone who cared about Emmett Sutton's well-being, and the corresponding wariness of someone who cared about Emmett Sutton's well-being, found her initial caution dissolving by the end of the first full day. On the third morning, Rose was in the garden when Emmett came out before breakfast to check the condition of the fence along the south side of the garden, where the soil was softest and the posts were most likely to shift. He found her there on her knees in the dark earth, pulling weeds with a focused efficiency that suggested she had been at it for some time. "You don't have to do that," he said. She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. "I know," she said. "I want to. The beans want room and they're not going to get it with all of this crowding them." He stood there a moment, looking at her in the early morning light with her hair pinned up simply, and her sleeves rolled to the elbow and her expression clear and purposeful, and then he crouched down beside her and began pulling weeds himself. They worked in silence for a while. Not the silence of people who have run out of things to say, but the quieter, more settled kind that comes when two people are doing something useful together, and the doing of it is its own sufficient language. "Why did you answer my advertisement?" he asked eventually. It was a question he had been carrying since before she arrived, and it came out more directly than he had planned, but he found that directness was simply the mode that this woman drew out of him. She kept pulling weeds. "Why did you put it?" she asked. "Fair," he said. "I'll go first then. I have 3,000 acres, 200 head of cattle, a solid house, and no one to share any of it with. I'm not a man who does well with certain kinds of loneliness. That's honest." "That is honest," she said. She was quiet a moment. "My mother died 2 years ago. She was the last of my family that mattered, and after she was gone, Cincinnati felt like wearing someone else's shoes. I was good at my work, the seamstress work, but I was good at it the way you can be good at something that isn't truly yours. I wanted land. I wanted the kind of work that grows things." She paused. "I wanted to start." He looked at her profile, the straight line of her nose, the set of her jaw, the way her eyes were soft at this moment in a way they had not been when she walked into town covered in dust. "That's a good reason," he said. She looked at him then. "So is yours," she said. They finished the weeding together. When they went inside for breakfast, dolers looked at the two of them coming through the door side by side with the kind of expression that said everything and announced nothing, and she set 2 plates on the table and went about her business with a serenity that was very nearly theatrical. On the 4th day, there was a matter with the cattle. 2 of the range cows had gotten through a section of broken fence on the eastern boundary and wandered onto the neighboring property, which belonged to a man named Gerald Flint. Flint was not, by the general consensus of the surrounding community, an easy man. He was litigious by temperament, and had a way of treating minor inconveniences as deliberate provocations that kept him in a state of perpetual low-grade hostility with most of his neighbors. He had sent a boy over to the Sutton place at midday with a message that was technically polite and substantively unpleasant, implying that Emmett's cattle management was inadequate, and that if it happened again, there would be consequences of an unspecified but clearly legal nature. Emmett read the message, folded it carefully, put it in his jacket pocket, and went to saddle his horse. Rose, who had been there when the boy arrived and had read the message over Emmett's shoulder, because she was not the kind of woman who stood at a distance from information that concerned the place where she was about to live, said, "I'm coming." He looked at her. "I can ride," she said. "You have that bay mare in the second stall. She looks steady." "She is steady," he said. "Rose, this is a boundary dispute. It's not, "I know what it is," she said, "and I'm going to be your wife in 3 days. What affects this ranch affects me. I'd like to come." He studied her face for a moment. Whatever he found there apparently settled the question because he said, "I'll saddle the mare." They rode out together, retrieved the cattle from Flint's property with efficient practicality, and then Emmett rode to the man's house to speak with him directly while Rose stayed at the gate with the recovered cows. Not because Emmett had asked her to, but because she had assessed the situation and determined that riding up to Flint's door as a pair, when one of them was not yet a resident of the ranch, would give Flint an opportunity to make the conversation about things that were not the actual issue. She watched from the gate as Emmett and Flint spoke on the porch for about 10 minutes. She could not hear the words, but she could read the bodies, Flint starting with a posture of aggressive authority, Emmett's answering steadiness that was entirely without submission, the conversation moving towards something that was not warmth but was a working resolution. When Emmett rode back to the gate, he said, "He's agreed to let it go this time, and he knows the fence will be repaired by end of week." "Good," Rose said. He looked at her. "You understood why to stay back." "I understood that you needed to handle it without him having something extra to argue about," she said. "That wasn't staying out of it. That was choosing the right position." He was quiet for a moment. The afternoon light caught the side of his face, and he was looking at her with that expression she had been collecting, small instances of, the one that was not quite what she had expected, and that she was becoming increasingly convinced was something she needed to understand better. "Yes," he said. "That is exactly what it was." They rode back to the ranch in the comfortable quiet that had become their natural register, and that evening at supper, when Dolers had asked about the Flint situation and Emmett had explained it, Dolers had looked at Rose and said, "You stayed at the gate." "Yes," Rose said. Dolers nodded, in the way of a woman who had been watching something develop and had just seen it confirm what she suspected. She passed the bread without further comment, which was in its way the most expansive endorsement she could have offered. The 5th day brought rain, a proper prairie rain, the kind that came in fast and meant business, and Rose stood on the covered porch in the morning and watched it move across the pasture like a curtain being drawn. The smell of it was extraordinary, that particular electricity of rain on dry Kansas ground that smelled like the earth itself exhaling. Emmett came to stand beside her on the porch with 2 cups of coffee, and she took hers without looking away from the rain. "You're not sorry you came," he said. It was not quite a question. "No," she said. "Are you sorry I'm here?" "No," he said. They stood there drinking coffee and watching the rain, and the awareness of the small distance between them, 6 inches, perhaps, the width of a half-turned shoulder, was a specific and considerable thing that Rose was quite sure they were both entirely aware of and neither of them was going to address directly, because it was the 5th day, and there were still 2 days before Saturday, and they were, at their cores, people who were careful about the things that mattered to them. But she turned her head to look at him at some point during the rain, and he turned his head at exactly the same moment, and they were much closer together than the 6 inches that had been the distance before, because they had both been leaning almost imperceptibly toward the other in the way of people who are drawn by something they haven't quite admitted yet. And they looked at each other in the gray morning light, with the rain coming straight down off the porch roof in a steady curtain. And something passed between them that was entirely wordless and entirely clear. He looked away first, not in retreat, but in the deliberate way of a man who is choosing to be careful. "Rain should let up by afternoon," he said. "Yes," she agreed. The cup in her hands was warm against her palms, and she held it there and thought about the way his eyes had looked for those 2 seconds, and she was not, she realized, afraid of Saturday at all. The wedding was simple and entirely right. Reverend Cole arrived in the late morning, a thin, gentle man who had the manner of someone who had presided over enough frontier ceremonies to understand that in this country, what people needed from a preacher was not ornamentation but sincerity. The sitting room had been arranged by dolers with the particular artistry of a woman who understood that beauty did not require abundance. There were wildflowers from the creek, blue and yellow and white, in every jar and pitcher that the kitchen possessed, and the morning light came through the windows at an angle that turned the whole room golden. Rose wore her second-best dress. The green one was still recovering from the road, which was a blue the color of late afternoon sky, and she had done her hair herself, simply but well, with just 2 of the small pearl pins that had been her mother's. She stood in front of the small mirror in the upstairs bedroom and looked at herself for a moment. This woman who had packed her life into a trunk, walked 11 miles in the Kansas heat, and was about to marry a man she had known for 6 days and corresponded with for 4 months, and she felt entirely clear about it. She felt clear, and also, she was honest with herself about this, something that she recognized from the letters, from the garden, from the porch in the rain, something that was considerably warmer than practical sense and considerably more precise than hope. Emmett was standing in the sitting room when she came down the stairs, and he turned when he heard her step, and the look on his face was not the look of a man conducting a business arrangement. It was simple and unguarded in a way that she had not yet seen from him, and it was, in its unguardedness, one of the most genuine things she had ever seen on another person's face. "You look very fine," he said, in that low, steady voice. "So do you," she said, which was true. He had put on his good jacket and someone had pressed his shirt, and he had the look of a man who had taken care with himself, which was its own kind of statement. Reverend Cole married them in front of dolers and Billy and Samuel and Thomas, who had apparently washed his face especially for the occasion, and the words of the ceremony moved through the small golden room like something that meant what it said. And when Emmett took her hand to place the ring, a plain gold band that had been his grandmother's, which he had mentioned in one of the letters, and the mention of which Rose had read 3 times. His hand was warm and entirely steady, which told her what she needed to know about his state of mind, since her own hand was not quite steady, and she was the most composed person she knew. When Reverend Cole said he could kiss the bride, there was a beat that lasted just a moment, the specific pause of 2 honest people who have not done this before, in this particular way, with all of this particular weight, and then Emmett leaned forward and kissed her with a gentleness that she had not quite expected, and that landed somewhere behind her sternum and stayed there. Billy Crane cheered with the enthusiastic redundancy of someone who has been waiting to cheer for some time. Thomas joined him. Dolers pressed her fingers to the corners of her eyes with the composed emotion of a woman who would never describe what she was doing as crying. They were married. The afternoon that followed had the quality of something settling into place, supper that dolers had prepared with evident love, stories shared around the table that let Rose hear more of the history of the place and the people in it, the easy warmth of a household that had been a good one and was becoming, in some not quite nameable way, more complete. And that evening, after the Reverend had gone back to town, and Billy and the Greer brothers had gone to the bunkhouse, and Dolers had retired to her cottage with the tact of a woman who understood the appropriate time to be elsewhere, Rose and Emmett were alone in the sitting room with the last of the supper candles burning low, and the whole of the prairie night outside was immense and full of cricket song. They talked for a long time. That was what Rose remembered most clearly, afterward. Not only what followed but the talking, the way the conversation moved between them in the candlelight with the ease of people who had been building toward this comfort for months and were finally in the same room with it. He told her about his father, who had started the ranch in the 1860s and worked it until his heart gave out, and how Emmett had taken it over at 20 and spent the better part of 11 years turning it from surviving into something. She told him about her mother's garden in Ohio, about the way she had learned to read by sitting beside her mother in the evenings when the sewing was done, about the peculiar specific loneliness of being competent in a place that did not fully need you. "I think," she said, at some point in the late evening when the candle was burning very low, "That I knew from your third letter." "Knew what?" he said. "That you were worth crossing Kansas for," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "The third letter," he said. "You wrote about the ranch in the rain," she said. "The way it smelled. You said it smelled like the earth was remembering what it was supposed to be." I had never heard anyone describe rain that way, and I thought, here is someone who pays attention. Here is someone who is honest about the things he notices. He looked at her across the small table. "You wrote about November on the river," he said. "I read that one 4 times." "4," she said. "4," he confirmed. She smiled. It was a full smile, unguarded, and he looked at it with the expression she had been collecting instances of since the day she walked into town, and now she knew what to name it. She had known for a while, if she was honest. She had known since the porch and the rain and the 2 cups of coffee and the 6 inches that had become less than 6 inches, and the moment they had both turned their heads at the same time. He loved her, or he was so far along in the direction of loving her that the distinction was academic. And she, well, she was keeping step. The summer settled over the Sutton ranch with a hot, generous hand, and the work of 2 people sharing a life revealed itself in the accumulation of days, which was both more ordinary and more extraordinary than Rose had anticipated. She took over the kitchen garden with Dollar's blessing and expanded it by a full third, putting in squash and sweet corn and a row of sunflowers along the south fence that she freely admitted were not productive, but were necessary for the soul, which made Emmett smile in the particular way he had developed. A slow smile that started in his eyes and arrived at his mouth slightly later, as if it had to travel some distance to get there. She also took over the household accounts, which had previously been kept in a system that could charitably be called organic and more accurately described as chaotic, and within 2 weeks had organized them into a legible ledger that told Emmett things about the operation of his own household that he had not previously known, including that he had been consistently overpaying for flour at the general store in Caldwell, because no one had ever compared prices with the mercantile in the next town over. "You've done more for this ranch's finances in 2 weeks than I've managed in 3 years, he said, looking over the ledger one evening. "You were busy with the cattle," she said. "Don't make excuses for me," he said. "I'm not making excuses," she said. "I'm saying you have a large operation and limited hours in the day, and flour accounting is not the highest use of the person who manages 3,000 acres and 200 cattle. We are dividing the work according to aptitude and time. This is mine." He set the ledger down and looked at her, and that slow smile started in his eyes. "You are a particular woman, Rose," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "Is that a complaint?" "Not in the least," he said. It was in the middle of July that Billy Crane brought home a problem. He came in from Caldwell on a Tuesday with his face set in a way that meant something had happened, and he found Emmett in the barn and Rose in the kitchen, and said he needed to talk to both of them, which was itself significant because Billy was not a young man who typically sought counsel. What he told them was this: he had been in the saloon the night before, not for drinking, he was quick to clarify, or at least not primarily for drinking, and he had overheard Gerald Flint talking with 2 men that Billy did not recognize, men who had the look of people hired for specific purposes. The conversation had been about the water rights on the creek that ran through the Sutton North pasture, the same water rights Emmett had been negotiating with the bank about for months. Flint was apparently claiming that his own property deed had a prior claim to that creek water, which would, if upheld by a territorial court, severely limit the Sutton operation's ability to water its cattle in a dry season. Emmett's expression through this recounting was quiet and very still, which Rose had learned was not the stillness of a calm man, but the stillness of a man keeping a great deal of himself very controlled. "The deed claim," Rose said to Emmett. "Do you have your original deed documents?" "Yes," he said. "And the survey maps from when your father filed the property claim?" He looked at her. "Yes, in the strongbox in the study." "Then we need to look at them tonight," she said, "and you need to get a letter to a lawyer in Wichita by end of week." Billy looked at her with the expression of someone watching a chess player they had underestimated take 3 pieces in a single move. They spent that evening at the study table with the deed documents and the survey map spread out, and Rose, who had spent 2 years in Cincinnati working in the office of a property man, as a secondary occupation when the seamstress work was slow, which was a fact she had mentioned in passing in one of the letters, and Emmett had apparently filed in the part of his memory reserved for important information, went through everything with a focused care that meant she found, at just past 10 o'clock, what they needed to find. There, she said, pointing to a line in the original filing. Your father's claim includes riparian rights to the creek from the point of the eastern boundary marker to the junction with the main branch. It was registered in 1861. When did Flint's family purchase their property? Emmett checked. 1867, he said. Rose looked at him steadily. His prior claim is not prior, she said. Your father's riparian rights predate Flint's deed by 6 years. The silence that followed was the particular kind that comes when something has been resolved, but the resolution is still settling. Rose, Emmett said, in a voice that was not quite his ordinary voice. Get the letter to Wichita by Friday, she said. Include certified copies of the 1861 filing. Yes, he said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his briefly, just for a moment. A touch that was nothing and was also everything about where they were in the accumulation of their days. Then he went to find paper and began to write. The legal matter resolved itself over the following weeks. The Wichita lawyer reviewed the documents and confirmed Rose's reading, and a letter went to Flint through proper channels that made clear the territorial court would find no merit in his claim. Flint, confronted with a situation that had more documentation than he had anticipated, retreated with the particular sullen quiet of a man who has been outmaneuvered and knows it. The North Pasture Creek continued to water the Sutton cattle without interruption. The summer ripened and moved toward fall, and the life of the ranch moved with it. The cattle drive that took Emmett and Billy and Samuel away for 10 days in August, during which Rose ran the household with dolers and expanded the root cellar stores with a systematic efficiency that left Emmett genuinely speechless when he returned and saw what had been accomplished. Thomas Greer, who was not part of the drive by virtue of his age and inexperience, had become Rose's project during the 10 days, and she had taught him to read the household accounts and mend harness leather and the rudiments of kitchen garden management. And he had absorbed all of it with the earnest gratitude of a boy who had not had much in the way of teaching and was hungry for it. You turned my youngest hand into a useful person, Emmett said, the evening he returned. He already was useful, Rose said. He just needed the opportunity to demonstrate it. She was standing at the kitchen counter when she said it, and he was leaning in the doorway, still dusty from the trail, and the sight of her there, entirely at home, entirely herself, in the room that was now genuinely their room, the house that was genuinely their house, hit him with a force that was nothing like the spring thunder of the first day but was its older, deeper equivalent, the kind that shook the ground rather than the air. Rose, he said. She turned to look at him. I love you, he said. Because he was a man who had arrived, over the course of a summer, at the conviction that honesty was the only appropriate language for the most important things. She was quiet for exactly one breath. Then she said, I know, in a voice that was steady and entirely certain. I love you too, Emmett. I think I have since the porch and the rain. The 5th day, he said. The 5th day, she agreed. He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and she met him halfway, and when he kissed her this time, it was nothing like the wedding kiss. It was the kiss of 2 people who had spent a summer learning each other and were now saying plainly what the summer had made true. She had her hands in the lapels of his dusty jacket, and he had her face in both of his hands. And Dolers, who appeared in the kitchen doorway with the timing of someone who absolutely had not been listening from the hall, took one look, made a sound of profound satisfaction, and retreated to her cottage. The fall came in golden and sharp, and the ranch moved into the rhythms of preparation. The canning, the storing, the cutting of firewood, the 1,000 tasks that the approaching winter required. Rose threw herself into all of it with the same focused energy that she brought to everything. And Emmett, working alongside her in the practical daily partnership of people who ran a ranch together, found that what had begun as an arrangement and become a love story was settling into something he had not quite had a word for, a deep, specific happiness, the kind that had roots in it. He had never been particularly good at speaking this sort of thing aloud, but he tried, because she deserved the hearing of it. They had a habit by now of talking in the evenings after supper, when the day's work was done and the lamp was lit and the prairie was dark and enormous outside the windows. He would tell her things that he had not told anyone, the fears about a dry summer, the grief that still arrived sometimes around the anniversary of his father's death, the specific loneliness of the years before she came. And she would tell him things in return, the details of her mother, the texture of the life she had left, the particular relief of arriving at a place that felt, for the first time in a long time, like it was actually hers. "I used to think," she said one evening in late October, with the first cold snap making the fire something necessary rather than decorative, that wanting something this specific was asking for too much. That you were supposed to want things in a general way and be grateful for whatever approximation you got. "Your mother?" he asked. "Partly," she said, "partly just the way things were. A woman in Cincinnati didn't have much room for specific wants. And now," he said, she looked at him across the fire, "now I have everything I wanted specifically," she said, "which is a very strange feeling to get used to." He reached over and took her hand. "Give it time," he said. "You'll get used to it." She looked at their hands together, his so much larger and work-tough, hers smaller but hardly soft. "I think I already am," she said. The winter was hard in the way that Kansas winters were hard, relentless, and honest about it, with no pretense of gentleness. The snow came in November and settled in for a long stay, and the work of keeping 200 cattle fed and healthy through the cold months was the most sustained physical labor that Rose had ever participated in. And she participated in it entirely, working beside Emmett and Billy and Samuel in the barn and the feedlots, her breath coming in clouds and her hands chapped and her feet in the boots that she had replaced, with much better socks and a more considered approach to break-in time. It was during a particularly long stretch of cold in January, when a blizzard had kept them all close to the house for 4 days, and the 5 of them, Emmett, Rose, Billy, Dolers, and Thomas, who had moved into the main house out of practical necessity, had developed the particular forced intimacy of people who are sharing warmth and resources, and had run entirely out of things to be formal about, that Billy Crane asked Rose over a card game. What had made her decide to become a mail-order bride? "Don't answer if you don't want to," Emmett said, from across the room where he was mending a piece of harness. "I don't mind," Rose said. She considered the question with the same seriousness she brought to important questions. "I think," she said, "that I understood that the things I wanted did not exist in the place I was, and that the things I wanted did exist out here, and I was not willing to wait for the world to arrange itself differently when I could arrange myself instead." "That's very sensible," Thomas said, with the admiring tone of someone encountering a philosophy that reorganizes how they think about their own possibilities. "It was also," Rose said, "because his third letter was very good." Dolers laughed. Emmett did not look up from the harness, but she could see from across the room the way his shoulders moved. "What was in the third letter?" Billy asked. "He described rain," Rose said. Billy looked at Emmett. "You wrote a woman a love letter about rain." "I wrote her a letter about rain," Emmett said carefully. "And she walked 11 miles through Kansas for it," Billy said. "I walked 11 miles through Kansas because the stage broke down," Rose said. "But you kept walking," Billy said. A pause. "Yes," she said. "I kept walking." Billy shook his head with the profound appreciation of someone who has just heard a story that confirms his most optimistic beliefs about the nature of things. "Emmett," he said, "you are a very lucky man." "I know," Emmett said. Spring came back the way it always did in Kansas, as a promise followed by a betrayal followed by a final honest delivery. The mud season was bad, and then the grass came up green, and the cattle moved back to the outer pastures, and the world opened up again in the particular Kansas way, all at once and all the way to the horizon. It was in March that Rose came to find Emmett in the barn with something in her expression that he had learned to read by now, not all of it. She was not an entirely readable woman, and he was glad of that, but the particular quality that meant she had something to tell him that she considered significant. He put down what he was doing. "I'm going to have a baby," she said. He stood very still for a moment. Then he crossed the barn in a few steps, took her face in his hands the way he had in the kitchen in August, and looked at her. Her eyes were bright and steady and full of everything they had accumulated. "When?" he said. "October, I think," she said. He kissed her forehead, her cheek, the corner of her mouth. She put her arms around him, and he held her in the middle of the barn with the smell of hay and spring air around them and the cattle shifting in the pasture outside. "Are you frightened?" he asked into her hair. "A little," she said honestly. "Are you?" "A little," he said. They held on to each other in the spring light, and the little was honest and the holding was more honest still. Dolores received the news with the composure of a woman who had been expecting it, and made the sign of the cross, and immediately began planning adjustments to the kitchen stores, with an energy that indicated she was prepared to personally ensure the nutritional requirements of the entire coming 9 months were met. Billy took off his hat and then put it back on, and then shook Emmett's hand with a grip that said considerably more than any words he managed. And Thomas Greer, who was 17 and still impressed by almost everything, said it was the best news he had heard in his entire life, which everyone agreed was somewhat overstated but appreciated in its sincerity. The spring planting that year felt different, fuller somehow, loaded with the specific weight of things being built for the long future rather than just the next year. Rose planted her garden with an expanded vision, adding a fruit tree plot in the southeast corner of the yard that would not bear fruit for years, but that she put in with the settled intention of someone who is certain of where they will be when the fruit finally comes. Emmett watched her plant those trees on a warm April afternoon, and felt something that he would later try to describe to her, and eventually settle on, as the feeling of a man who had found the exact right coordinates in the world after a long time of being slightly off course. He told her this over supper, awkwardly, in the way that he still sometimes became awkward about the most important things because they mattered so much. She listened to all of it and then said, "You describe things well when you let yourself." "Only to you," he said. "I know," she said, and reached across and covered his hand with hers. The summer passed in the fullness of all their days. The cattle and the garden and the accounts and the evenings, and the gradually changing shape of Rose's body, which she regarded with a practical wonder that was entirely her own. She did not slow down in the way that some women were expected to. She slowed down in the way that was sensible, adjusting what she did to what she could do without compromising herself or the child. And she and Emmett had one serious conversation about the limits of her participation in the heavy ranch work that resulted in a fair agreement, because they were people who arrived at agreements by talking honestly and listening carefully. She taught Thomas Greer to write properly. He had been functionally literate, but his penmanship was a charitable description of a disaster. And by July, he was writing letters home to his family in Missouri that he said his mother cried over, which Thomas relayed with the embarrassed pride of a boy who loves his mother and knows she loves him. Samuel Greer, Thomas's brother, revealed in the course of a long June evening that he had been corresponding with a woman himself, a schoolteacher in Wichita who had placed an advertisement in the same publication where Emmett had placed his. He told this to the supper table with the careful air of a man bracing for ridicule, and received instead the enthusiastic interest of a household that had personal and positive experience with the arrangement. Rose told him what she knew about corresponding honestly and meaningfully. Dolores told him what to cook when the woman visited. Billy told him to make sure his good jacket was pressed. Emmett last told him simply that if she was the right woman, he would know it from the letters before she ever arrived. Samuel looked at him for a moment. "How?" he said. Emmett thought about it. "The letters will feel like they know you," he said. "Like she's writing to you specifically, not to an advertisement." Samuel nodded slowly. "That's what they feel like," he said. "Then write back," Emmett said. The summer turned to fall, and the preparations for October were the work of the household dolers in particular, who had midwifery experience from her years in the territory, and who had assessed the situation early on and made clear that she was entirely capable, and that a doctor would be fetched from Caldwell if needed, which gave Rose the practical comfort of a plan. The child came on a Thursday in mid-October, 1 year and 5 months after Rose Rhodes had walked 11 miles into Caldwell with blisters on her feet and fire in her eyes. And the birth was hard and honest and long, and Dolers was steadily and immovably present through all of it. And Emmett was outside the bedroom door for 9 hours with his hat in his hands, in the particular agony of a man who loves someone completely and cannot protect them from the thing they are going through. When Dolers opened the door and said, "You have a son," Emmett went into the room and sat on the edge of the bed beside Rose, who was exhausted in the complete physical way of someone who has done the most demanding thing a body can do, and she had the baby in her arms, this small, red, furious new person who had arrived demanding everything and was clearly not going to moderate that demand. Emmett looked at his son and then at his wife. "Are you all right?" he said for the second time in his acquaintance with her. The same question, from the street in Caldwell, which felt like a different country now. She looked at him the way she had looked at him then, directly, with those clear dark eyes that had been burning with something since the first moment he saw her and had never stopped. "I will be," she said, "once I've slept." He laughed, which was not what he had expected to do in this moment, but was exactly right. She smiled back at him, tired and genuine and entirely herself. "What do we call him?" Emmett asked. She looked at the baby. "James," she said, "for your father." He had told her his father's name in one of the letters, a passing mention, not a significant one, or so he had thought. She had kept it. "James," he said. He kissed her temple very gently and held his son for the first time, and the three of them were there in the October afternoon with the light coming in through the curtained window, and it was the most complete thing Emmett Sutton had ever been inside of. Billy Crane, informed of the birth by Dolers, climbed up on top of the barn roof and fired a shot into the air, which was entirely unnecessary, and which Emmett would reprimand him for in the morning, and which everyone on the property understood completely. Thomas Greer cried a little and then firmly denied it. Dolers made chicken soup and left it outside the bedroom door with instructions. The winter that followed was the winter of James Sutton's first months in the world, and it was a winter that the whole household gathered itself around in the way of people who have a reason to make the place as warm and full as possible. The baby was a serious, watchful infant who regarded everything around him with the alert attention of someone taking careful notes, which Rose said was clearly inherited from his father, and which Emmett said was clearly inherited from his mother, and which Billy said was inherited from both of them, and God help everyone on this ranch in about 15 years. Samuel Greer's schoolteacher came to visit in November, a composed and intelligent woman named Clara Hatch, who arrived on the stage, which arrived without incident, to the general relief of everyone who heard the story of the original arrival, and stayed for a week. And by the end of the week, Samuel had asked her to correspond further with a view toward making it permanent, and she had said yes. Which prompted another unauthorized shot from Billy Crane, that this time Emmett did not even attempt to reprimand. The year turned and James grew, and the ranch grew with him. Emmett had added 40 head to the operation in the spring, and Rose had taken on the bookkeeping for 3 neighboring farms whose owners had heard about what she'd done with the Sutton accounts and asked if she would consider it for a fee, which she had considered and agreed to, on her own terms and in her own time, which was how she agreed to all things. Emmett watched her doing the accounts one evening in February, The lamp pulled close, her hair down for the night, the baby sleeping in the cradle beside the desk that he had built for her when she took on the accounting work, a proper desk, sized for her with good drawers and a flat top for spreading documents, built with the specific attention of a man who wants to make useful things for someone he loves. She looked up from the accounts and caught him watching. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. She studied him for a moment with those clear eyes. "You're thinking something," she said. "I'm thinking that a year ago I was standing outside the land office wondering if I had made the right decision," he said. And she said, "And I should have been wondering whether you were going to have second thoughts about arriving," he said. "I should not have been worrying about myself at all. The more interesting question was always yours." She tilted her head. "I never had second thoughts," she said. "Not once," he asked. "Not even when you were walking 11 miles in the heat." "Especially not then," she said. "Walking was the first thing I did here that felt like it was genuinely mine. The stage breaking down was just an obstacle. Walking through it was mine." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the Kansas winter moved against the house with the sustained patience of a season that was going to take its time regardless. Inside, the lamp burned steady and the baby breathed in the cradle and the fire was good. "You are the most extraordinary person I have ever known," he said. She looked at him for a moment, and the expression on her face was everything that the blistered, dusty, fire-eyed woman walking into Caldwell had been moving toward from the first step. "I know you mean that," she said. "I do," he said. She reached across and turned the account ledger so he could see it. "The North Pasture water rights are clear through to 1900 according to the registration," she said. "And if you extend the east fence line another quarter mile, there's room for another 20 head in the summer pasture without overgrazing." "I know," he said, not looking at the ledger. "Emmett," she said, in the particular voice that meant she was choosing to be businesslike because the alternative was something she was not quite ready to say in the lamplight. "Rose," he said, in the particular voice that meant he had already said it. She looked at him for another moment and then said, "We are going to need another room built if this household keeps growing." "Is it going to keep growing?" He said. She looked at James in the cradle. She looked at Emmett. "I think it might," she said. "It did." Clara Hatch became Clara Greer the following autumn, and moved to the small house that Samuel had built on the edge of his family's property. And by the next spring, she was teaching the children of the surrounding farms in a proper schoolroom that the community had decided was needed, and had built together. The way the frontier communities built the things they decided together were necessary. In a single long weekend with every spare pair of hands, and enough food to sustain a small army. Rose contributed to the school the way she contributed to everything practically, specifically, and generously. She donated the first year's supply of paper and ink from the household accounts, which she could afford to do because the household accounts were in excellent shape. She also donated 4 hours a week of her own time, sitting with the older children in the afternoon while Clara handled the younger ones, helping with mathematics and reading, and what she called the practical uses of both. Thomas Greer, who was 18 by now, and had become in the past year something considerably more than the impressed boy who had stood at the fence watching the wagon arrive, sat one evening on the porch with Emmett and said, very seriously, that he thought Mrs. Sutton was the best person he had ever met in his life. Emmett agreed with him. "She taught me to read properly," Thomas said. "She fixed Samuel's bookkeeping so he doesn't owe the feed store money anymore. She found that water rights thing that saved this whole ranch from Flint's claim, and she walked 11 miles. 11 miles, Emmett agreed. Thomas shook his head. "She just decided she was going to get here," he said, in the voice of someone who has spent considerable time thinking about a specific thing. "And then she did." "Yes," Emmett said. "I want to be like that about something," Thomas said. Emmett looked at the boy, who was not really a boy anymore, not quite, and thought about the particular responsibility of being someone that a young person watched and tried to learn from. "Then decide you are," he said. "That's the whole thing, Thomas. You decide and then you do. It's very simple and very difficult." Thomas thought about this for a long time. The spring that James turned to brought both warmth and change to the Sutton place. Emmett had been approached by the county land commissioner about serving on the Water Rights Arbitration Board for the territory, a position that would require occasional travel to Wichita, but that carried both compensation and the kind of influence that mattered for the long-term security of everything he had built. He had sat on the information for 2 weeks before telling Rose, which she pointed out with characteristic directness, was 2 weeks he had wasted not deciding. "I haven't told you yet which way I'm leaning," he said. "You should take it," she said. "You don't need to." "Emmett," she said, in the way she said his name when she wanted him to stop performing consideration and get to the point. "You are well suited to it. You care about the land rights. We have the means to manage the ranch during your travel periods, and you will regret not taking it. Take it." He looked at her. "What if I don't want to be away from you?" She softened, which she did in the specific way of a person who keeps their softness carefully and only releases it when it's earned. "Then come home quickly," she said. He took the position. His first trip to Wichita lasted 8 days, and he came home to find the ranch in better order than he had left it. Rose had reorganized the barn storage while he was away, a project she had been wanting to address for some time, and which, she pointed out, was much easier to execute without the ranch's owner expressing opinions about the placement of things that had been in the wrong place for 11 years. He stood in the reorganized barn with James on his hip, looking at the logic of what she had done. "It's better," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her, she looked at him. James, who at 2 was developing a personality that combined his father's steadiness with his mother's focus in a combination that Dolers described as either going to be the most useful person in Kansas or the most formidable, grabbed at Emmett's jacket and said a word that was trying to be Papa and succeeding more each week. "I missed you," Emmett said. "I missed you too," she said. "Next time try to make it 6 days." "I'll try for 5, he said. The years moved in the way of good years, full and various and sometimes hard, but with the specific quality of hardness that comes to things that are being built toward rather than endured. The ranch grew, methodically and deliberately, in the direction of something that would outlast both of them, which was the point from the beginning. Emmett brought the North Pasture into full production with a new water management system that Rose had worked out on paper before he had the practical idea, which he acknowledged with the graciousness of a man who had long since given up any defensiveness about where the good ideas came from. What mattered was the ranch. What mattered was them. Billy Crane, at 25, finally managed to speak his feelings to the blacksmith's daughter, a young woman named Mary with a quick laugh and strong hands who had been waiting for 2 years, with the patient exasperation of someone who could see clearly what the other person was taking a long time to arrive at. The wedding was held at the Sutton Ranch, naturally, because by 1885, the Sutton Ranch had become the center of a small community of people bound together by shared labor and shared history, and the particular warmth that accumulated in places where people were genuinely glad to be. Rose stood with Mary before the ceremony and gave her the specific advice that she felt relevant from her own experience, which was primarily about honesty and about not performing a smallness you did not feel just because some people found it more comfortable. Mary, who was not a small person by nature, received this gratefully. Emmett stood beside Billy and said, considerably less than Rose had said, which was that it got better every year if you let it. Billy looked at him and said, "Every year." "Every year," Emmett said. The ceremony was simple and entirely right, and Dolers cried with the composed certainty of a woman who knew exactly what she was crying about and considered it worth every tear. Thomas Greer, at 20, had by this point decided the thing he was going to be decisive about. He wanted to learn the law, specifically the land law of the territory, which he had become interested in through watching Rose navigate the water rights matter, and through his subsequent 3 years of handling some of the Sutton accounts. He had saved what he could from his wages, and Clara, his sister-in-law, had been tutoring him through the correspondence materials from a Kansas City law college that had begun offering distance instruction. He came to Emmett and Rose in the spring of 1885 and said he wanted to leave the ranch to go to Kansas City and finish his studies properly. Emmett and Rose looked at each other across the kitchen table. "You should go," Emmett said. "We'll miss you," Rose said. "But you should absolutely go." Thomas stood there for a moment with the expression of someone who had expected more resistance and was not quite sure what to do with its absence. "I feel like I'm leaving," he said. "You are leaving," Rose said gently. "That's what you're supposed to do. You'll come back different and you'll be better for it and you'll do good work. This place will still be here." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. "I want you to know," he said with the earnest formality of a young man saying something he has been composing for a while, "that what you did for me, what both of you did, I don't think I would be going anywhere without it." "You would have gotten there," Emmett said. "Maybe," Thomas said. "But slower." They saw him off on a September morning, and Rose stood beside Emmett in the yard watching the wagon take Thomas Greer toward the road that led to Caldwell and the stage line in Kansas City, and whatever came after, and she felt the specific bittersweet quality of watching someone go well. Emmett put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him the way she had learned to do, not as something borrowed but as something that was completely hers. "He's going to be excellent," she said. "He is," Emmett said. James, who was 4 now and understood approximately half of what he witnessed and concluded entirely his own things about the other half, stood at the gate watching the wagon until it disappeared and then said, very seriously, "Where is Thomas going?" "To learn things," Rose said. "Can I go learn things?" James said. "Someday," Rose said. "When?" "When you're older," she said. "How old?" "Older than 4, she said. James considered this with a gravity that suggested he found it a fundamentally unsatisfying answer. Emmett took his son's hand, and Rose took her son's other hand, and they walked back to the house together. The second child came in the winter of 1886, a daughter this time, and they named her Caroline after Rose's mother. She arrived with the decisive energy of a person who had places to be, and from her earliest weeks she regarded the household with the specific bright attention of a child who is already, clearly, going to have a great deal to say about everything. James received his sister with a solemnity that suggested he had been thinking about this development for some time, and had arrived at a cautious acceptance. By the second week, he had appointed himself her guardian in a way that he had not discussed with anyone, but that was evident from the manner in which he stationed himself near her, wherever she was placed, and regarded anyone who approached with the assessing eyes of his mother. Emmett watched his son one afternoon standing over his daughter's cradle with this air of serious responsibility and felt something so large and specific that he had to go outside and stand in the cold for a minute to accommodate it properly. Rose found him on the porch. "James is in there being a big brother," Emmett said. "I know," she said. "It started yesterday." "He gets it from you," Emmett said. "That particular quality," she said, "I believe is genuinely his own." They stood together on the porch with the winter prairie quiet all around them and the lamp warmth coming through the windows behind them, and Emmett put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they looked out at the enormous dark sky that was full of more stars than could be accurately counted, the honest Kansas sky that was not pretending to be anything other than what it was. "Rose," he said. "Emmett," she said. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "When I stood outside that land office 3 years ago and watched you walk into town," he said, I had this thought that was not a practical man's thought at all. I thought that whatever had brought that woman through that much difficulty and that much dust and 11 miles of Kansas, I wanted to know what it was. I wanted to understand it and be near it. She was very quiet. And I have been," he said. "Every day since I have been near it, and it has made me, I am a better man for it. A better rancher, a better neighbor, a better father. I am better at everything for knowing you." She turned to look at him. The light from the window was just enough to see her expression, which was open in the way that she opened for him and only for him, the way the country opened at the horizon all at once and all the way. "You were already good," she said. "I was adequate," he said. "There's a difference." She laughed. which was one of the sounds he thought he would go to any lengths to hear for the rest of his life. She turned in the circle of his arm and faced him and put both hands against his chest. "I walked 11 miles, she said, because I made a decision and I was going to see it through. But I truly did not know what I was walking toward. I thought I was walking toward a practical arrangement with a reasonable man." She paused. "What I found was considerably more than that." "Yes," he said. "You are the most important person in my life," she said plainly in the way she said the most important things. "You and James and Caroline and this place. This is everything I wanted specifically. I want you to know that." He kissed her, there on the cold porch with the stars overhead and the lamp burning inside and their children asleep in the house behind them. "I know," he said, against her hair. "So do I." They stood there a while longer because there was no reason to rush. The ranch was secured. The water rights were clear. The cattle would winter well. Thomas Greer was going to be an excellent lawyer. Samuel and Clara Greer had a son now, born in November, who James had already declared his best friend on the basis of 3 visits. Billy Crane was happy in the way of a man who has finally done the brave thing and found it was worth the wait. Dolores was in her cottage with her lamp burning and her coffee and her rosary, and she was entirely and specifically where she wanted to be. And Rhodes Sutton now, though she still sometimes thought of herself as Rhodes the way people think of the name they first learned themselves by. Not from loss but from continuity, stood in the arms of her husband on the porch of the house that was genuinely hers, in the middle of a country that had been honest with her from the first step, and felt the settled, specific, boundless happiness of a woman who walked toward what she wanted and found, when she arrived, that it was even more than she had known to name. In the spring of 1887, a letter arrived from Thomas Greer, now officially studying at the Kansas City Law College, detailing his progress and asking if he might bring a fellow student home for a visit over the summer, a young woman named Harriet who he said was studying the same area of land law, and was, in his view, the most sensible and admirable person he had encountered since leaving the Sutton Ranch, which he hoped they would take as the highest compliment he was capable of giving. Rose read the letter aloud at the supper table. Emmett, across from her, said nothing but smiled the slow smile that started in his eyes. Dolores said, "I will make the guest room ready." Billy, who had joined them for supper as he often did, said, "Every single person who comes through this house ends up in love. It's the land, or it's you too, probably both." James, who was 5 now and had opinions about everything, said, "What is in love?" Rose looked at her son. Then she looked at her husband. "It means," she said, "that you find someone who makes you more yourself than you were before, and you decide to stay near them." James considered this with the grave concentration he brought to important information. "Do you and Papa have that?" he said. "Yes," Rose said. "Since when?" James said. "Since the 5th day," Emmett said. James decided this was satisfactory and returned to his supper, and the kitchen was full of the warmth and noise of people who belonged to each other, in a house that had been built for exactly this purpose, on a piece of Kansas land that extended to a horizon so wide and honest that there was no pretending anything was smaller than it was, and Rose Sutton sat in the middle of all of it, with her husband's hand covering hers on the table, exactly where she had decided she was going to be, exactly where she had walked 11 miles to get to. The blisters had long since healed. The fire in her eyes had not gone anywhere at all.